The Treaty of Ghent officially ended the War of 1812, and although the treaty was signed in late 1814, conflict still raged on throughout the country due to the slow communications of the time. As news of the treaty spread, the British troops began to withdraw. The last British troops to leave American soil was not until the spring of 1815. But surprisingly, this was not the last time enemy troops occupied American soil. There was a little-known invasion in World War II, where Japanese troops occupied 2 Aleutian Islands of Alaska for an entire year. During this time, they established military bases and constructed defensive fortifications. These troops were finally expelled in the moment in history called the Battle of Attu, 1943. It is unclear as to why the Japanese invaded the Aleutian Islands. Some believe it was to act as a diversion for their Midway campaign, but they came prepared to occupy the islands for a long time. Years before the war, many understood the strategic importance of the islands. In 1935, U.S. General Billy Mitchell told Congress,
"I believe that in the future, whoever holds Alaska will hold the world. I think it is the most important strategic place in the world."
The Japanese likely felt the same, and not only could they prevent the Americans from launching attacks upon their Pacific operations, they could also launch their own attacks on the U.S. West Coast. In June 1942, the Japanese bombed the communications center and fuel depot in Dutch Harbor, and then they landed over 8,000 troops unopposed on the 2 westernmost islands of the Aleutian Islands, Attu and Kiska. They encountered no resistance and found only a handful of native Alaskans still on the islands. The climate on Attu posed a formidable challenge for the Japanese. Wrapped in dense fog for most of the year, the islands suffered from constant snow and rain and relentless wind. These conditions hampered their efforts to construct defences. But there were also logistical problems with supplying so many troops. Nevertheless, they adapted to the conditions and managed to set up surveillance and communication systems to monitor Allied movements in the Pacific. The year-long Japanese occupation on American soil was a devastating blow to American morale. However, still stinging from the attack of Pearl Harbor, as well as preparing for war on multiple fronts, the US ignored the Aleutian Islands for the time being, while more pressing matters took priority. In March 1943, the US finally put their plans of retaking the islands into motion. After the Battle of the Komandorsky Islands in the Bering Sea, the US took control of the sea lanes, cutting off the Japanese supply line to the Aleutians. In May, when the harsh winter weather abated, the US landed 11,000 troops on the north and south sides of Attu. They encountered light resistance from the Japanese because they retreated into the mountains. The terrain of Attu proved very difficult for troops to haul in supplies and heavy weapons. After securing the shores, the US troops marched into the mountains to flush out the entrenched Japanese. They were told this would be a 2 to 3 day operation. However, it took nearly 3 weeks. The climate on Attu was the biggest obstacle for the US troops. They arrived ill-equipped and ill-prepared for the conditions. Many men suffered frostbite and succumbed to the frigid, wet conditions. Still, they marched onwards and upwards, slowly crisscrossing the island to root out the isolated Japanese units who hid in deep bunkers and caves. The engagements were small but fierce, and after weeks of exhausting work, the US finally trapped the remaining Japanese on a hillside. The Japanese were cut off and running out of food and ammunition, but surrendering was not an option for them. Instead, they launched a surprise banzai attack. Just before dawn, waves of men rushed out of their hiding and attacked the US positions. This was one of the largest banzai attacks of the Pacific War. It caught the Americans completely off guard, and the Japanese punched through numerous combat posts, fighting all the way back to the rear support units. The hand-to-hand combat was brutal, but the American numbers and firepower was too much to overcome. In the end, 2,000 Japanese troops lay dead and a dozen taken prisoner. The Americans suffered 550 dead. With Attu now back in US hands, the US set their sights on Kiska, the other Aleutian island the Japanese occupied. This island was reported to have more advanced fortifications and 10,000 Japanese troops. Thus, the Americans looked at this next challenge with caution. They didn't want another Attu experience, which was unexpected and costly in lives, with a determined and entrenched enemy and harsh environmental conditions. Aerial reconnaissance of Kiska found decreased Japanese activity, and it was noted that radio transmissions ceased entirely in late July. This led some to believe that Kiska had been evacuated, but others felt that the Japanese had merely retreated into their labyrinth of underground bunkers, as they did in Attu. This meant another drawn-out and bloody battle. On August 15th, 3 months after Attu was liberated, US and Canadian forces finally landed on Kiska, each on opposite sides of the island. Troubles were encountered immediately as ships bottled up in the harbour. Cold winds whipped up, and a dense fog shrouded the island. The troops quickly became disoriented. The eerie quietness of the island was disconcerting, and the men were at their breaking point. Although they encountered no Japanese troops as they slowly inched their way inward, their level of panic increased as they ventured deeper into the remote wilds. Rumours of snipers spread, and several men were killed by mines and booby traps. The elevated anxiety of the troops and the thick fog came to a head when a Canadian soldier opened fire on American troops, mistaking them for Japanese soldiers. This erupted into a friendly fire shootout that left 28 Americans and 5 Canadians dead and 50 wounded. Officers reported that unnerved troops were shooting at anything that moved. This chaos and fear continued for 3 days, at which point they realized there were no Japanese left on the island. Although Kiska was back in American hands, the operation was a hollow victory. The Japanese had evacuated the island 2 weeks earlier, once they realized their position was untenable when Attu fell. The Allied casualties from friendly fire, mines and booby traps added up to 92 men dead and 221 wounded. The battles of Attu and Kiska, while often overshadowed by other campaigns, were pivotal in the Aleutian campaign's success and the broader Pacific theatre. They taught invaluable lessons in adaptability, the significance of intelligence, and the importance of readiness for every eventuality, principles that have since become integral to military strategy. Thank you for watching this moment in history. If you liked this episode, please like and subscribe.